Amanda Van Dyke is no stranger to responsible raw materials. Amanda has given us a talk on a number of occasions because she is one of those investors who actually lives what she says. And so the fund that Amanda runs really does use ESG and sustainability as a core part of making those investment decisions, and then also working with those exploration development companies, etc., to make sure that where they are exploring or developing raw materials projects, they do so keeping ESG really very much at the forefront. From a personal perspective, I've had the true delight of working with Amanda and her team across a number of different projects. And what's really exciting to see is that where a project may not be perfect, because to be honest, no project is perfect when you start, the dedication that Amanda and her team have shown to really help those projects improve and put the right things in place and acknowledge the fact that it costs money to be responsible. So therefore, the short-term return that an investor might expect to see, actually with regards to ESG, looks slightly different because it involves different aspects of value, not just the financial aspects. Now, Amanda, we can share slides this end.
Sorry, I was trying to share my slides and I'm encountering technical difficulties.
That's quite all right.
If you wouldn't mind, that would be great. I'll just sort of set up the preamble slightly. We are investors in the space, and we believe in sustainable investing, which is a process. It's not, there's no checkbox. This is a sustainable investment, this isn't, and do X, Y, Z. Making projects sustainable is an ever-evolving process. And part of what we do is try to constantly work, and it involves working with all of the other stakeholders that are in the world of mining, as it were, and understanding all of the things that make mining work and going from there. My background and part of how we make our decisions is understanding which commodities we need to invest in. What are the commodities? A big part of our decision making before we even get to making the decision on which actual investments are the most sustainable or that we can make the most sustainable is understanding which commodities we should go into. So that's sort of the basis of this. And I come from the finance side, which is, you know, how we balance understanding in the sector. So I will jump to the third slide if possible and talk about demand and supply, and why do we care about critical minerals? Why is everyone talking about critical minerals right now? And the reason for it is that the train that we're on as a society, as a world, and I think just about everybody has acknowledged it, although people are on different paths to getting to a net zero transition, it's going to require a lot more metals. There is no scenario in which we get to a lower temperature in the world that doesn't involve electrification and significantly more metals is required. EVs are the ones everyone talks about because it's the easiest, and we will need about 2.5 times more metal for every car that we produce. That's an EV versus an internal combustion engine based on present technology. But the much larger demand on metals that's going to drive demand going forward is actually from renewable power and infrastructure. As we slowly but surely, and it is it's a transition, decommission the coal plants and recommission all of the myriad ways in which we are going to find cleaner energy and lower carbon energy. All of those lower carbon energy forms that we have right now that we know of, the wind, the solar, the nuclear, even the hydroelectric, and all of the interconnected grid that all of that electricity runs on, that is all very metal intensive, significantly more metal intensive than a coal-fired power plant, unfortunately. And then you come to the sort of thing that's happening in the background. Everyone's talking about the energy transition, but there are demographic trends in the world that are actually much stronger than the energy transition. And that's global urbanization. The UN and just about every other body in the world, there's been a marked trend that started in about 1980, when about 80% of the world still lived in a rural environment, to by about 2050, they think a solid 80% of the world is going to live in an urban environment. And people who live in urban environments, whether that urban environment is Guangzhou or Kansas or Kinshasa, those urban dwellers tend to consume per capita between 2 and 3 times more commodities per person than a rural dweller. So behind all of this global energy transition, we have a transition where the people and their consumption patterns and their development patterns are driving considerably more demand for commodities across the board. So the question is, how are we going to meet that demand? And that is the subject of what I'm speaking about. Next slide, please. How much the energy transition, which is the primary reason that everybody's thinking about, one of the things they say is that, like, it's very, very metal intensive. But according to Tesla, and I have to admit, we have to attribute the information and then people get to argue with it. But according to Tesla, the fossil fueled economy is actually incredibly inefficient. And once it's built, arguably the sustainable electricity generation from all the ways it comes from is a great deal more efficient. So that energy transition is going to be significantly more efficient. But before we can get to that energy transition, we need to build all the infrastructure. And what fossil fuels have on the rest of the world, as it were, is that all of their infrastructure is built. We have all the coal-powered stations. We have all of the gas-powered stations. We have all of the gas infrastructure in place. The world knows how to use fossil fuels, and they might be using them reasonably inefficiently, but there are trillions of dollars in already built fossil fuel infrastructure out there. And in order to get to this lower carbon and arguably much more efficient form of and sustainable form of energy, we're going to have to build trillions more dollars in infrastructure for the renewable power economy. And that is why it's going to take time, and it's going to be a slow process. And we need to figure out the most efficient, even within this already more efficient methodology, we need to figure out the most energy efficient methodology. Next, please. And part of that is figuring out which technologies are going to be used and what we need to do. These clean technologies, which are largely renewable power, EVs, all of that sort of thing, they use different metals than the fossil fuel economy used. An internal combustion engine uses a different suite of metals. Not only do we use more metal, but we use different metals. And part of that is we don't just need to build all of this new infrastructure for a clean energy electrified economy. We also need to use different metals that we used before, and we need to process them into different materials than we used before. And that is part of the structural change that is taking time. We don't just need more mines, we need different types of mines, we need different types of refineries, and that sort of thing, to be formed into different types of materials that make a solar panel, that make like the batteries, the huge batteries that go in windmills and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And the big question out there, the huge question out there is how much? How much more do we need, and what do we need? And I'm going to preface this with the calculation of what we need is debated, that we need significantly more, between 2 and 4 times or 5 times more metal to be mined today than we've mined in different times is absolute. But which metals are we going to need in which quantity? Right now, to meet the Paris Agreement goals, and by 2050, based on present technology, this is the sort of accepted estimate of how much more we're going to have to mine per annum. 5 times more lithium, almost 5 times more cobalt, 4 times more graphite, and then a host of other things that we never mined in serious quantities before. Indium. I'm not sure a lot of people know what indium is. And significantly more copper per annum. But as we go, and that means that we need 11 times more of the largest lithium mine in the world to be built for that annual production. 15 times more of what is now the largest cobalt producer in the world to be built. 26 times more of the largest graphite mine in the world. That's hard to contemplate. And then if we go to the next slide, please. These are estimates. And because of these estimates, because everybody's arguing about which technologies are going to be dominant, how fast realistically can this energy transition happen? The goals of the Paris Agreement are great, but the difficult steps to getting there, the finance that we'll talk about more, the financing and the amount of society that needs to come together, that's led to significantly different forecasts for how much we need. And these are all of, I put in front of you, there's a 4 times split. So between around, and this is about the most commonly understood energy transition metal is lithium, and lithium carbonate is the most common product of the mines. The variation that we're going to need just by 2026 is 300 to 1200. That's a 4 orders of magnitude difference by incredibly intelligent and well-respected commodity forecasting groups. That's a huge difference, and that's based on the differing views on how strong our economic growth is going to be able to support the energy transition. What technologies are going to be out there for us to use? How supportive will government policies be of the energy transition? Will production be able to keep pace? Some people think that we simply won't grow because we won't be able to find and develop enough mines in time. Will recycling play a larger role than it plays at present, which at least in the lithium-ion battery metals supply chain is very, very little at this point in time globally. Will the prices just get too high? Is the cost benefit analysis, will we keep consuming and keep electrifying at the pace we're electrifying today if the lithium price is 5 times higher? Because that's the demand and supply. These are the kind of questions that we're asking that's led to such a huge variation in what demand is going to be going forward. My personal opinion, and I need to make sure it's my personal opinion here, is that we will transition and we will get reasonably close to the Paris Agreement goals. But the path that we're going to take to get there and the pace at which we're going to get there is not going to be something we can forecast accurately because there's too many players. Much like mining, there are just too many factors at play to be able to, even with ChatGPT and quantum computers, the human element is different. And there's so many factors that affect demand, including supply, like can we supply it, that we're going to have to roll with the punches to some extent. As get on, we're all getting on the train to energy transition, but the route that the train's going on is a little bit different. So next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, I'm just saying we are going to energy transition, and there are huge challenges to that energy transition from every level of society. The fact that it's going to happen is absolute, but from the very beginning, there's been a very, and it goes to the theme of this entire conference. If we're going to energy transition, we're energy transition because we want a cleaner, more sustainable planet and a more sustainable future for the human race. But getting there has to be sustainable. We do not want these metals, and we do not want renewable power at any cost. And at least in the West, society has been very clear about that. We want to energy transition, and we want to do it sustainably. And while I think that there are huge numbers of tools available, there has been a breakdown in trust between society in the past and the mining sector. And if we're going to provide the metals, we're going to need to get society as a whole to trust that we can get them those metals in a sustainable fashion. And that is why the route to the energy transition is going to be meandering, and we're going to have to build trust with society as a whole and prove to them that this sustainable transition can happen in a way that's balanced for everyone. So next slide, please. And these are the challenges out there. Right now, geopolitics cannot be ignored. So I'm going a little bit over time, I'm realizing. So I'm gonna have to go quite quickly now. And I will, geopolitics is a huge element that is pushing down supply of metals. We are in a bit of a supply chain. The supply chain right now is largely Chinese, because the Chinese, credit where credit is due, saw the need for an energy transition earlier than we did and secured global supply before most people in the West realized that critical metals and a supply chain of critical metals was going to be required for the energy transition. Right now, the rest of the world is playing catch up. They've realized we need the critical metals, but they haven't secured the supply, nor have they built the infrastructure for developing that supply. Part of the challenge to building that infrastructure, to build those mines and securing the supply, is getting enough money to do it. You know, Tesla, as one of the people who forecast demand, thinks we need over 400 billion to be invested by the end of this decade in new mine supply to be able to meet that demand. And that's just by 2030. 400 billion is a lot of money in just the mining side. They think there's another 200 billion that's required in mining processing. And that's a lot of money in a capital constrained industry. And it's harder to get that financing when commodity prices are incredibly volatile. The lithium carbonate price went up 1,300% in 2022 and is down 65% this year. It's very hard to finance a mine when and get the hundreds of millions of dollars you need to finance a mine when nobody knows what the returns are going to be on that mine. In addition, and I prefaced this very carefully earlier for a reason, we need to be very careful about making forecasts about how much metal we need for technology, because technology is advancing rapidly in our space. Part of being able to harness renewable power effectively, sustainably, and efficiently is building grid scale batteries. Right now, we're using lithium ion batteries, which are not particularly efficient at all for grid scale storage. And there's a bit of a war out there to figure out what will be the effective grid scale storage. A lot of people think there'll be sodium batteries, which are some of the cleanest batteries in the world, or will they be vanadium redox? Will the internal combustion, will lithium ion batteries tomorrow look like the lithium batteries of today? I don't know. So people are trying to make forecasts based on an unknown technology future. At the same time, the mining industry is trying to decarbonize the supply chain and ensure that we have full supply chain transparency, because that is what civil society is demanding of us. And I think that in order to achieve all of this, in order to get enough metal to get through the energy transition, we all need that supply chain transparency is going to be the biggest and most important factor in making the energy transition work and being able to source all of those critical metals, because we're going to need to have an understanding, like Kitla was saying earlier, of what it's going to take, an understanding of how we're going to get there, and an understanding that we can do this sustainably, because that's going to be what it takes. We're all going to have to work together. There is no way we can get there and meet all of these significant challenges without all of civil society, technology, miners, and global governments and legislation coming together to enable the transition, because it's too big a challenge to do without considerably more dialogue and trust between all parties. And I think I've gone a little bit over time, so I'm going to stop there. And if there's any quick questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Amanda, as always, really, really, really fantastic. Not only as a summary, but also to see your insight and I guess your interpretation as well of what's going on here. Not saying that it's different to what other people are saying, but just the way that you put it is fantastic. And I think allows us to kind of get inside the brain of someone who is there going, well, how do we invest in these areas and how do we propel all these aspects forward? So round of applause, everybody, for the fabulous Amanda. Absolutely brilliant. Amanda, I've got one question my end. If anybody does have questions, pop them into the chat or the Q&A, etc., and we'll feed them through to Amanda. So Amanda, your slides are fantastic, and as well looking at the different types of batteries, etc. Recently, I've been engaged in conversation with a lot of the hydrogen fuel cell providers and developers. What are your thoughts with regards to the fuel cells? Because of course they make use of a slightly different array of materials, such as the platinum group metals, which perhaps we're more used to because we've been mining them for ages for catalytic converters. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts with regards to that aspect.
So one of the reasons for the huge variation in the forecasts for demand is that nobody really understands what the future technologies are going to become dominant. It's going back to my childhood, VHS versus Betamax, which I don't think anyone understands anymore. We don't know which technologies. I think we need to be very careful with hydrogen fuel cells because there's a perception in the world that hydrogen is a like-for-like clean replacement for natural gas, and that we could run everything on hydrogen. Hydrogen fuel cells for large-scale transport, at least, lithium-ion batteries don't really work well once you get above the size of like a van. And they're not particularly efficient, and they don't last long enough for industrial use. And trucking is a huge global business. I personally believe that hydrogen fuel cells are going to, in large scale transport, hydrogen fuel cells are the long-term solution. But in terms of, there are serious challenges to like for like. Hydrogen is not the solution for everything. Right now, we need all of the renewable power we can get to just plug it into the grid, and using the renewable power we have to create hydrogen is actually quite inefficient. Part of what we discussed earlier was efficiency in energy technologies, and burning, frankly, clean electricity to make another form of fuel is not particularly efficient. I think hydrogen becomes useful when we have a great deal more clean energy and maybe spare clean energy, and it'll also have different applications. I think that the energy demand, the metals demand mix to support these technologies is going to evolve. Those forecasts that I put in front of you are not going to be the same in 5 years or 10 years. They're going to be different based on things like more hydrogen fuel cells, especially in the large transport sector. But we need to base it on something, so we make all of our assumptions based on present technology. I think hydrogen fuel cells, like many things, will play a role, but my personal opinion is that the battery mix and the metals used in the energy transition for power generation and the technologies used, it's not going to be a dominant technology. It's not going to be hydrogen fuel cells or hydrogen is the solution. It's going to be a huge number. The solution is actually more complex rather than it is simple, and it's going to evolve over time.
Awesome. No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Amanda. We can open up the most glorious discussion with regards to all of this, because as well, depending on how macro we look, it's almost like, okay, so what's the energy footprint of producing hydrogen versus the energy footprint of producing the raw, it goes on and on and on, doesn't it? And it becomes really interesting. So Amanda, thank you so much, as always. Round of applause. Brilliant.